Okay, good afternoon. Welcome. We're going to get started. I'm Marya Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact and the Academic Director of the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship here at Oxford. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you, those of you here in the room, those of you joining online, delighted to welcome you to today's Insights for Action seminar. This seminar is a special one, not only because it's Valentine's Day, but we are co-hosting today with the Aspen Institute UK, which is a charity that supports and inspires people to build a better society. And I want to especially welcome the Aspen Institute UK Rising Leaders, some of whom are here with us today. The seminar series overall, Insights for Action, explores how researchers and practitioners within Oxford and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action and for impact. And today we're building on a conversation we had last month at the seminar where we talked about purpose and responsibility in business. And today we're going to link that to issues of ethics and ethical business and ethical leadership. And we have some really wonderful conversation partners to do that. I'll just briefly introduce them and then we'll get into the discussion. So Anjali Sarkar, who is the Program Director of the Global Leadership Challenge, which is here at Oxford, run by the Oxford Character Project. Anjali leads a wide range of leadership and character development programs, working with students and also with professionals. And she's trained as an international development practitioner. She spent many years working at BRAC, which is one of the largest NGOs in the world, as many of you will know, that BRAC works to bring digital financial services to millions of women in Bangladesh. And Anjali has been recognized with many different fellowships. I'll just name a few: Senior Atlantic Fellow at LSE, a Dalai Lama Fellow, a New Voices Fellow at the Aspen Institute, a Global Shaper at WEF, but we're perhaps a little biased. She's a Skoll Scholar alum, which is something that is very special to us here. We've got another here in the audience as well. So welcome, Anjali. Ruth Girardet is an executive and leadership coach. She's got 20 years experience in corporate responsibility and corporate ethics. Ruth has worked in a bunch of different sectors and on boards on matters of ethics and corporate culture. She spent a number of years at Tesco as the Group Corporate Responsibility Director, and I hope we'll build on that experience in the conversation, working on issues of corporate strategy across a range of domains. And then she was then the CEO of the criminal justice charity Just for Kids Law until 2018. She's also worked with Aspen Institute UK and across Europe to deliver the Aspen Executive Leadership Seminar, and I hope we'll touch on that as well. And finally, Dr. Athol Williams, who is a colleague of mine here on the faculty at the Business School as a lecturer in management. Athol holds a PhD in political philosophy from Oxford, as well as master's degrees from Harvard, MIT, LSE, Oxford, and London Business School. Athol has a range of professional experiences as well beyond the academic experience, with executive roles in corporate strategy and management consulting across several countries. And he also has a long history of public service promoting youth literacy and resisting corporate corruption. And I hope we'll bring that into the conversation as well. A core theme across all of Athol's work is the possibility of ethical behavior by individuals, by corporations, and by society. And that's, of course, central to our conversation today. Welcome to all of you. So we're talking about ethical business. So why ethical business? So let me give a little bit of context in terms of how that links to what we do at the Skoll Center. The Skoll Center was started over 20 years ago, really to help build the field of social entrepreneurship. And social entrepreneurship at that time was quite nascent, and we were one of the early institutions that was trying to shift management education to transform how we educated students who were going on to business careers, to make impact and social entrepreneurship more central, to build a field of research, and to build a community of people doing social entrepreneurship. And of course, the landscape has evolved quite significantly in the last 20 years, and we have evolved in our work as well. And increasingly, we work with social entrepreneurs who are doing grassroots work outside of business, but also in business and in large corporations, not just in smaller entrepreneurial ventures. And that has brought us, as we've started to do that work, closer to the topics of purpose, responsibility, and ethics in business. And that we see as a core set of issues and a core role for business to play in driving positive social impact and systemic change is to think about how we can embed purpose and ethical leadership and ethical practices into business, and in particularly in large firms as well as small entrepreneurial ventures. So that's the context for this conversation. Now, I'm an academic. Others are academics here too. And so we often start with, well, what do we mean by this term or this concept? And so that's what I want to start out with here on ethical business. We talk about ethical business. What does that mean? Ethel, I'm going to start with you.
I think it's a problematic term. There's often a word salad around responsibility and sustainability and ethical and purpose. And we attempted to use these synonymously, and I think it's a mistake to use them synonymously because they mean very different things. So when we talk about ethical business, we're in the realm of ethics, which is around right and wrong and good and bad. And so defining a business as ethical, we are making a value judgment about everything that business does is good or right, or everything it does is right or wrong. And I think that's complicated and difficult to do. When we talk about a profitable business, it's a lot easier, right? We've established rules and processes and guidelines of knowing what a profitable business is. So what is this thing called ethical business then? Are we suggesting that a company who's ethical as just behaves in a particular way all the time? And so I think that's part of the challenge of around this. I think linking it, even in our title, relating ethics and purpose are very different things. I can have the purpose to kind of exploit people. That would be my purpose, right? And we often say, oh, we're a purposeful business. Well, I think that's meaningless until you define what that purpose is. So for me, as a starting point, I would say an ethical business, and it's not about intent, because often executives talk about they're an ethical business and they're expressing an intent. The intent is to do the right thing. But until you define that, it becomes meaningless. So I certainly want to begin thinking about more or less ethical businesses rather than this dichotomy of ethical and therefore if I'm not ethical, I'm unethical, right? I can be more or less ethical. But I think we've got to start with the thinking around it being a business that does no harm, or if it does harm, remedies that harm. So a business that operates by doing no harm, and when it does harm, it remedies that harm.
Okay, thank you. Anjali, how does that land with your view of ethical business?
I love when something starts with, this is problematic. You know you are in for a good time. Actually, our approach at the Oxford Character Project is based on virtue ethics and moral philosophy. So we would like to think about practical wisdom here. So the idea goes back to 2000 years ago when Aristotle was talking about, oh, what does good mean? What does wise mean? So here, in very simple terms, if I think about ethical businesses, I would like to think about a business that is doing the right thing for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time. Some might say that is very aspirational, and I fully agree that we need to blend aspiration with action. It's not enough to put some values on the wall or on the annual report and say that, we have done our job. We haven't. So I think, yes, it's difficult to make sure all the boxes are ticked, but this is something that we can strive for. Not a perfect example, but if we are thinking about all of these four aspects, doing the right thing for the right reason, at the right time, in the right manner, then probably we are going somewhere.
Okay, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm sensing that there's some element of intent that you're willing to let in here. You're not having any of it.
I mean, I think the difficulty with that formulation is we don't know what the right thing to do is and for whom. And the for whom is actually more important than knowing what the right thing to do is. And so I can say, and many do say, I'm doing the right thing by exploiting workers because I'm minimizing cost to the benefit of my shareholders and my customers, right? Now, is that the right thing to do? So we've got to say for whom. If I'm saying I'm doing the right thing for my workers, well, then I would want to create an environment that respects their human rights and it's actually humane conditions. So the right thing is not enough. And part of the formulation is the right thing at the right time. I think it's got to be the right thing for whom? Because why this is problematic is we fundamentally find that this idea of profitable business and ethical business are often in tension. And the tension's uncomfortable, but that's where we got to have the discussion, right? So businesses that do good, that's also profitable, that's not worth the discussion. That's the easy stuff, right? But where the business has the need to do some social good that comes at the expense of their profits, I think that's where ethics comes in, and that's where we're going to have the discussion. So I said, for example, a company has done harm, right, should then go and make remedy. That remedy is not going to advance their profits. That remedy is going to cost the business. For me, that's what ethical behavior requires by my formulation.
Okay, I think one of the things you're both starting to get into is the whom, the people, right? Who's involved. And for me, that links to the process, right? So of course there's an outcomes, like what was the action, right? What is the result? But how do we get there? Who do we involve? Who are we considering is, I think, a piece of this. Ruth, how would
Thank
you
you.
define ethical business?
I have to say I'm feeling a little bit intimidated by the amount of academic prowess around me. So forgive me if I'm sort of a little bit simplistic. It's both my background and being German. I are on the side of being direct. But let me add maybe to what's been said so far. So the three things I'd like to add. So the first one, for me, it's not the businesses that have ethics, it's people that have ethics. And I know that that is more nuanced than I'm putting it, because of course businesses have legal personhood and there's a whole lot of criteria around how you enter contractual obligations, etc. But I think by talking about ethical business, we sometimes forget about the responsibilities of the individual and we let people off the hook. So when we talk about bad businesses, we tend to forget that there are actual decision makers who are sitting there taking decisions, and it is people who are writing the policies, and it is people who are shaping corporate culture. So that would be my first point. I think it's really important to kind of have that distinction between who are we describing? Are we describing a business as ethical, or are we describing people's behavior as ethical? My second point would be that I think ownership structures really matter when we talk about ethical businesses. So yeah, if you're the sole owner, of course, your ethics can define how your business operates. That's not a problem. But Athol, you are taking us to, the tension between profit and business. Well, if you don't own the business, you are owned by shareholders. Well, whose ethics, right? And I think we fall danger of thinking that there's a certain set of ethics that is shared by everyone, and that becomes very problematic in any business environment that's not a very small family business or maybe a cooperative. But even then, you've got a number of different stakeholders. And my third point would be that I don't think I've ever come across a business that would state that it wants to be unethical. So I'm not sure that the distinction is between what is an ethical business and what is an unethical business. I think the distinction is probably between businesses who expressly state that they wish to be ethical and businesses who don't make any ethical pronouncements. And I think universities are actually a really interesting example in that respect. So this idea that we're encountering a lot at the moment of institutional neutrality, I think there are plenty of organizations who have decided that actually negotiating between the different stakeholder ethics and taking a stance as to which position is privileged over others is not possible. And that therefore institutional neutrality is actually the way in which an organization is going to operate. And I don't think that is inherently unethical, but maybe we want to discuss that further.
I think we'll come to that. I want to pick up on something that you said and go back to you, Anjali, because you talked about doing the right thing. And how do we know what the right thing is? And you said, no one's going to say they want to be unethical, right? But just like you said, there could be many purposes. There could be, perhaps one could think, many ethics. How do you figure out what is the right thing?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? So one example, I know there are quite a few MBA students in the audience, right? And if you ask them, especially people who are thinking about developing a startup, what problem are you solving? They will give you the perfect answer in a nanosecond. All of them know how to articulate it very well. What problem are we solving? Ask them, what problems are you creating? Not many people know. Even if people know, they are not going to stand up in front of their investors and confess that, you know what, these are the potential unintended consequences, but not unknown consequences. Are you thinking about that? And then if you have clarity about that, my second question would be, what are you doing to mitigate them, right? And then if you have an answer to that, my third question would be, are you doing enough? Now, I'm giving the example of MBA students, but that applies to all the businesses out there. Do they know what problems are they creating? Do they know if they have a solid plan to mitigate them? And are they doing enough? So what the right answer is here, that doesn't really come with a formula. There's not really a specific kind of very simple equation that will tell you all the time what the right thing is, but you have to consider a lot of different things, which are not often shown in the balance sheets, which are not often, coming with very, very straightforward reasons, but you have to take into account exactly. And the question Ethel mentioned, like, who is this for? So I think all of those, it's not to say that it's very vague and should not be done, not doable at all. It's doable, but it's more complex than a simple answer, what that right thing is.
Can I comment on that? Mariah? It's interesting. So this debate about what the right thing to do is, when you speak to a victim of an injustice, they always know exactly what the right thing to do is, right? Stop abusing me, stop exploiting me, stop discriminating against me. It's simple, actually. It's often the party committing the injustice that debates what the right thing to do is. So I guess we can have this debate. I'm taking a stand that says, at least I've offered, that says, do no harm, right? Now we can debate what harm is, but you ask someone who's a victim of oppression what the right thing to do is. They'll say, take the boot off my neck. And so if we're running businesses that are causing harm, and again, Anjali's right, often businesses don't know, but there are many cases where businesses do know, right? If you're sourcing your products from sweatshops, you know part of your value chain, your supply chain, the harm you're part of, right? Now that's not an easy solution, but at least it kind of, we've got to admit first that is something that's problematic. Ask that person working in a sweatshop what the right thing to do is, and they'll give you a very clear answer.
I think that highlights two things, well, but between the two of you. So one is, again, ask the person, right? Whose voices are in the conversation about this, and broadening those voices and perspectives seems core to what you're saying. And you're suggesting ask the questions, right? You did give an answer to how do you know what the right thing is. It's a sequence of questions. The answers will be different every time, but that's a process, right? That one could go through just and ask them of and with the people who are experiencing injustice.
Maybe I could
Yeah.
give a different example of unintended consequences, which is nowhere near as stark as yours, Ethel. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my time at Tesco, and I think I should just preface them by saying this is more than a decade ago, and I wouldn't be able to evidence anything with numbers today, and also I'm massively simplifying in order to make a point. So, but I'll just tell you a couple of examples. So, mine is more about your point of unintended consequences and assuming that we all have shared beliefs. So I live in Islington, and there's a very clear sort of ethical environment where I operate. And one of the things is of course packaging is really bad. And so about 12 years ago, one of the things I was trialing was to remove packaging from fruit and vegetable in stores. And there's clearly that is the right thing to do. So let me just kind of preface everything with that, but unintended consequences. So one of the ways in which Tesco operates is if you're a director in charge of an initiative, you have to work in a shop and see how it actually works in practice. So I got myself till trained, and I was put in a superstore in Essex, and I spent a week behind the tills, and I was watching what was going on with my unpackaged vegetable and fruit. And a number of things happened. So one unintended consequence was there are lots of KPIs that are being tracked all the time. So the productivity KPI massively went down because it takes a long time at tills to work out what the fruit is. You have to measure it, etc. And that's the core success criteria for every shop. It's one in front. There are no queues, right? So queues were building up, and actually bonuses are directly linked to this. Second thing that happened, and again, this was tracked, is our CO2 emissions went up because more fruit and veg was spoiled, right? People wouldn't take some of the fruit. It wasn't protected by packaging, etc. Third thing that happened, and this was the one that really surprised me, was I was causing a lot of issues at the tills because, yes, some people don't know the difference between a conference pear and some other type of pear. That's fine. But actually, a lot of the till staff didn't know what an avocado was. And then they couldn't actually enter that into the till. And so I'd actually really embarrassed my colleagues by having them have to ask the customer what the customer was buying. So I was impacting productivity, I was impacting environmental performance, and the one that actually mattered to me most was I was embarrassing my colleagues. And I'm not saying that these aren't all solvable things. I think that's what you were saying, is it's about asking the right questions. But unintended consequences mostly come from an initial assumption that you're doing the right thing and everybody else will think so too. And I think that's the hardest thing, is, you know, trying to stay ahead of that.
Okay, so this gets us into the territory of how do you do it, right? How do you, if you are trying to be ethical or to become more ethical as a business, how can you go about that? And what would that look like? I mean, you talked about it, you had sort of a operational packaging decision that you made and so got to the, retail floor level to sort of see how it played out. So we can think about it at that level, but also at, well, you talked about ownership, right? Ownership and governance structures as well. So open it up to any of those levels. Where have you seen, or what have you seen working well to help businesses become more ethical?
Silence speaks a volume.
Pass the buck, right? I mean, you've probably got the sense that I'm highly skeptical of what most businesses do, what they call ethical business, right? Even talking about values. I love the wonderful analysis, and I invite you to do this. Take the list of all the recent scandals, corporate scandals, and then go to their annual reports the previous year and look at the values they espoused, right? And then look at where you work, and I bet you it's all the same values. There's a limited set of values we can choose. Everyone's focused on integrity and diversity and valuing whatever they want to value. So a lot of these things are not sincere, are not done with real intent, right? And intent to follow up, to take action. So on the one hand, we can say, well, talk about purpose and values and ethics is all just window dressing, and 90% of the time it's exactly what it is. It serves the business purpose. So, and that for me is absolutely great, right? So put all the ethics and compliance stuff in your marketing department and leave it there. But if you're saying business has a responsibility, you mentioned responsibility. If we are saying business bears a responsibility to address social issues, right? Now we would say, well, is that where the sentence ends? Or are we saying business bears a responsibility to address social issues only if it helps make profit? And so the companies that I've seen who have taken this seriously are the ones who say, we will embrace this idea of our social responsibility and do that because it's the right thing to do for the beneficiaries, not for our shareholders or ourselves. And at core, I think the difficulty we face is we often see business as separate from society, right? So think even in our language, we've got the private sector, which business falls under, right? It's private, it's separate from the rest of us, which is civil society or the public sector. Right? Everything our language says, what happens in business is separate from society. Now, if you're a CEO and you take the view that business is separate from society, then we've given role permissions for you to behave in a way that doesn't necessarily need to abide by society's rules, social norms, or even ethics. If I take the view that business is part of society, that business is a social institution, and I bear responsibility then like any other institution to that society, I behave very differently. So the first distinction I see when I speak to executives is, what's your answer to those two? If you see business as part of society, I think you understand responsibility far more than if you see business separate from society.
This is very core to what we do at the School Center in our work with students and with others around systems thinking and thinking about not just individuals and businesses, but all organizations as embedded in these complex systems. And it completely shifts your mindset. Okay, so what do we do with that? I'm going to go back to you because you didn't tell us how you address this problem of unintended consequences.
Well, I mean, I think Anjali actually did. It's a repetitive process of asking the right questions and then addressing those questions. But I think, Ethel, I think there are a couple of assumptions that you made that I'm not sure are necessarily shared assumptions. So, do businesses have to contribute to a better society? And if so, what does that look like? I'm not sure that's a resolved question. I would also say that even some of the toughest Tesco directors that I've met would not have said that they were separate from society. I think they would have said that the entire success of an organization that feeds the country is based on being part of that society. Now, that gets us directly to the question of means and ends, right? Which you started us off on. So, and I think part of the challenge in answering your question is I think we very often think of purpose in a very narrow way. Does purpose have to be something that is normative? Not something that is bad. I mean, you gave us an example of I wish to exploit my workers, but what if the purpose of an organization is to provide nutritious, affordable food at good prices? That can be a purpose. So then it all becomes about the means, right? Is the way in which you go about it. And so, in answer to your question, sorry, that was a roundabout way. I think there are two ways of looking at ethical businesses. One is the structural piece, and I think we'll come to that, which is all around governance. It's all around policies, boards, risk management, those really technical specific things. And then I think there's the individual leadership piece. Who are the people in your business? What are their values, and how able are they to access and express those? And again, we can talk more about that.
Yes, I'm going to go there now. I want to get to this individual leader bit because this is core to my work. It's certainly core to the work that you do, and I think both of you as well. So we talked about ethical businesses, and we've also heard that perhaps we should really be thinking about the individuals, right? And so let's talk about ethical leaders in particular. All of you are working with leaders in various ways. How do you work with leaders? How do you develop ethical leadership and ethical leadership practices? And Anjali, maybe I start with you and you can tell us a little bit about how you do this at the Oxford Character Project.
Yeah, so actually, as long as you are thinking about ethics as a very big, grand scandal out there, and it has nothing to do with you and your everyday business, I think we are doing it wrong. No big thing happens overnight. Even if it's a very big thing that people only got to know from the newspaper, it was long due. So when we talk about ethical leadership, we actually try to bring that into people's everyday behavior and practice so that it doesn't become a slippery slope. You make one compromise and soon it becomes another, and then a very big thing happens. In our programs, and we work with a lot of students and young professionals, and many of them go into various business positions, various positions of responsibility around the world, we talk about character-based leadership. And by character, we mean a set of habits or dispositions that consistently shape how we think, feel, and act, not just what we say, not just saying that these are my values. It's about thinking in that manner. It's about feeling what I'm thinking. It's about doing what I'm, saying that I will be doing. So it's a combination of all of those things. And we see that a lot of leadership education, because we are talking about leadership here, we focus probably a lot on the leadership competencies and skills, which are really important, but we believe that we need to elevate character alongside competences. Think about a doctor who's super good at, slicing people up, but has no compassion for the patients. I would not like to be treated by that doctor. We need compassion and the competency. Think of any profession, you need both. So I think because we are over focusing on competencies, people know how to communicate, people know what to say, people know what to write when it comes to the marketing reports, but people are not actually doing that. So there comes the gap between aspiration and action. And in our work, we just say that competencies are fantastic. Your school, your formal education is covering that, but we need to talk about character, and we need to make it our everyday practice. Think about how you interact with your colleagues, your friends, your family. Character is there. Character manifests in all the micro moments in your daily life. So if we are not thinking about ethics as this, very big thing that only happens to big people out there, no, it's about us. It's about all the decisions that we make on a daily basis. That's how we try to bring it to home and make it a part of their life, how they live, how they lead, how they do everything.
Okay, thank you. And I would want to follow up to learn more about how you actually do that, but we'll come back to that. Ruth, so how does what Anjali described resonate with the work that you're doing at the Aspen Institute UK with the Rising Leaders?
A lot. And, you know, it's really interesting actually listening to you describing that gap between doing things well, or the different ways in which we can do things well, right? By either being very excellent or doing it from right motivations as well. I think instinctively, the word character makes me worried because it makes me feel like it's something you're born with. And one of the things we really strongly believe as part of the Rising Leaders Fellowship is that ethical leadership is something that can be learned. It's like a muscle, it needs to be exercised, but it is something that, you know, we can all do. And I think, and this is my personal view, I think being an ethical leader it's not about being a good person, because I think the jury is out on what constitutes being a good person. I think it is about your ability to access your set of values and to articulate those well. I think that's what it's about, accessing your belief system and then being able to explain it. And the challenge of business is most of the time the decisions you're making isn't a decision between right and wrong, right? Because if there's a clearly wrong answer and you go for that, you're probably not a great leader. You're probably also not going to be very successful in business. The real challenge of operating in the business world is that a lot of times the decisions that you have to take are between wrong and wrong. And that's when you need to be able to access that. And can I give one more example? I mean, the rising leaders in this room will be very familiar with this particular example because I tell it a lot. But one of my challenges was I had to respond to a Greenpeace campaign on how tuna is fished and the tuna supply chain. And again, this is a long time ago. And the way in which tuna used to be fished is with something called a fish aggregating device. And a fish aggregating device is an underwater bomb. And so basically what you do is you put that in a swarm of tuna, you explode it, all the tuna floats up, and then you collect it. Everything else also floats up. It's called bycatch, and a lot of the bycatch is endangered species. So what Greenpeace was asking us and the other retailers to do was to move to something called pole and line fishing, which is exactly as you would imagine it. You've got a really long line, and then you've got hooks on it, and the hooks only attract tuna. The problem with pole and line fishing is it's incredibly dangerous. There are open boats on high seas. There are no sides. They're very, very long lines. And a lot of the labor on those boats was bonded labor. So it was a real human rights issue. And then the board said, you can't increase the price of tuna on the shelves in the UK. And that wasn't because the profit margins on tuna were great. They're not. The argument was it's the cheapest protein in the country, and it is the main source. Our main customers are the prison services, the NHS, and schools, right? So you can't change that price. So you have a really, you know, this is not a kind of conflict between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. It's a conflict between, you've got animal sustainability, you've got human rights, and you've got, you know, your home customers. And how do you take those decisions? And I think that's why, you know, I really like this idea that by being able to access your own beliefs, you're never going to make a great decision in that situation, right? And I mean, I can tell you, my answer in that moment was that for me personally, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room would react differently, but human rights outweighed all other considerations. So I wasn't prepared to recommend going to a different fishing method. And that's very unsatisfying, right, in the moment. And it is also a short-term problem because we can address it. Obviously, we can change the supply chain. But the real problem of ethical leadership is when you have to make those decisions where there is just no great outcome.
Absolutely. And some of the work that I do and that we do at the center talks about, so partly it is exactly what you're saying, sort of how do you make the sort of the internal, what are your habits and practices, and how do you take those into decisions in that moment? And some of it can also be sort of what you preface it with, which is an understanding, right, of like, what are the trade-offs, right? And what are we, and sort of, again, it goes back to the voices of who's in the room, which perspectives are you taking into account so that that decision is informed by all of that. So Athol, you teach here at Said across many programs. How do you bring ethical leadership practices into the classroom?
I mean, I do think I always try and draw the analogies to or the linkages to things we all understand quite clearly, right? So if we're saying ethical leadership, now we're saying, oh, it's all fuzzy. Okay, but let's go to things we understand quite clearly and see what we can learn. So if I say I'm a decisive leader, right, or we operate in an environment where there's decisive leadership, we might say, well, we can understand that because this leader lays out the principles by which decisions will be made, demonstrates them by the actions and the decisions they make. And so we can say, okay, I can see a decisive leader is one who behaves in a particular way. So I'd want to say, well, then an ethical leader should be something quite similar. And a big part of then identifying this ethical leader or being this ethical leader is being explicit about the principles by which you're going to make decisions and what's going to guide your behavior. Now, I want to suggest that very few companies have that explicitly. And I've made it my business in any company I go into is to help them translate their gibberish into what it really means, right? And most of the time I never get invited back to those companies because they just don't like when you make it that explicit, right? So what happens as an individual, right? So I go to work, I believe lying's wrong, let's say, right? But in my company, the guys who are getting all the bonuses, all the promotions, are lying to customers all the time. In fact, it's such a norm, right, that we don't even realize it's something that's problematic. Now, when I go to the wall in our reception, it says, yeah, our values and our codes of ethics. It doesn't say we endorse lying, right? But aren't we endorsing lying by promoting those people, giving them the bonuses, or just simply looking the other way? So you could argue in this case, right, lying is part of the ethics of that company. Now, as a leader, then you're going to say, well, I want to be an ethical leader. I then got to call it out, make that very explicit and say, we will not lie, even if it means we lose clients. And very few are willing to go to that extent, right? Because we all have the real competitive challenge of saying, well, all my competitors are lying, right? So we need to do the same. All my competitors are bribing. So it depends on the environment you're working in. But if you're working in an environment of injustice where bribery and corruption is rife, there seems to be an accepted reasonable argument that says because everyone else is doing it, we also ought to do it, right? Now, I want to argue that's not ethical leadership. Because ethical leadership then has to take a stand and say, on what principles are we going to act? If our principle is we will do whatever it takes to get work or to get revenue, well, right, then make that explicit. But I think it's often, for me, so my guidance to ethical leaders, someone wants to be ethically saying, make it explicit, right? And if you don't like what you've written down in terms of what's explicit, then change that behavior, right? But not the words in the reception. How you promote people, what you endorse, who you give bonuses to.
Okay, so you've brought us to the last topic I want to cover, which is how do you handle the situations like what you just described, right? Where your own ethics don't align with what you observe, the revealed ethics, if you will, of the organization you're part of. And how do you handle those situations? You've started to offer us one view of that.
Yeah.
How do you help people handle those kinds of situations?
I think different situations call for a very different set of responses, and there's no answer that could solve it all. However, I think one common mistake that many people and who are really good at heart, what they do is they try to do it alone. And our first advice to our students is never try to do it alone. You know, people are out there, people may share your values, people may have a different set of values, but if you are aiming for big changes, never try to do it alone. So it's about having clarity so that you know what you stand for, you know how far you are willing to go, you know, to protect it. Sometimes that means staying within the company and trying to initiate changes by having other people on your side. Sometimes that means going out there and protesting. It depends on the situation, depends on who you are, to what level you have, you know, your influence within the organization, outside the organization, who are your friends, who could be your friends, who are not, you know, by your side right now. So it's about, again, making that good judgment, hitting that right balance, not going, you know, not putting yourself in danger right away, because then, you know, you will be kicked out and then nothing will happen. But really understanding, you know, having that clarity to know what do I have and what can I do with it. And if I don't have it all, then who can I talk to? Whose support could be on my side, and I can address this problem. And on top of that, I think taking a long view, it helps. Sometimes we expect things to happen very quickly. We feel very strongly about something, and I want to see that change right away, which is really, again, it's a great thing great passion, and it's fantastic to have it, but also to be patient about it. A lot of people, they don't have the patience to, ask 100 people and deal with that rejection, and again ask the 101 person, like, can you help? So I think having patience, and also knowing that you don't have to do it alone. If it's a fight worth fighting for, then there should be other people too who are feeling the same way.
So I just want to go back to where you started, which is this, as I heard it, so this notion of there's a spectrum. I mean, there's also a long time horizon potentially, but think about what are you comfortable with, right? And what can you do, and who else can you enlist? And there's some really great work by Deborah Meyerson, who's an organization scholar, who had a book. It came out many years ago called Tempered Radicals. And she talks about the notion of sort of choosing your resistance form. And some are very overt and out there, and that's the whistleblowing, right? And some are, she has this wonderful example, again, it's quite a dated example now, but of a surgeon who felt, a female surgeon who felt she couldn't, sort of be herself at work wearing lace socks, which was like her covert statement of who she was at work. And this is not about ethics, but it was sort of, that's at the other end of the spectrum. And so thinking about this as I love the idea of thinking about this as you have an array of ways to respond, and where are you, and what can you marshal at that point? Ruth, how do you think about this?
Well, I think you've both said some really valuable things. I really like, Athol, your point about, asking an organization to be explicit about their values. I think that's a very good starting point. I really like your approach of don't go it alone, and this idea of, choose your battles and choose the time frame. So, I mean, again, just speaking from my own experience, I think the conflicts I've encountered most often aren't so much between individual ethics and corporate ethics, but about how an organization manages the inevitable conflicts that happen in any organization, however well run it is, and seeing how the policies kick in, how conflict that exists is actually being managed. You mentioned whistleblowing. I mean, I sit on a number of, I sit on some boards, and one of the key questions is always, how many whistleblowing incidents have you had? And honestly, 0 is not a good answer, because it means you haven't got a very effective risk management process. But if I can add one thing to the kind of to how we would advise, especially young people, I think being able to be wrong is a real leadership superpower. So even if you feel really strongly about something, if you do what Anjali has described, and you actually engage with people, and engage with people who disagree with you as much as you engage with those who agree with you, I think if you're able to also occasionally see that you've been wrong, that can be a super strength as a leader. And that's particularly hard when you're young, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to just put a little pressure on that idea of taking the long view and following a process, because the challenge of that, of course, is you could be seen to be complicit in whatever that wrong is, right? So if we're causing some harm, whatever the harm is, and I'm silent about it, or I'm trying to wrestle with my colleagues to kind of get it right, but saying I'll take the long view, I think that's the risk we face. And that's a difficulty of saying, when do I act? What actions do I take? What are my range of actions? And so, yeah, I think an ethical leader has to adopt an ethical position, right? And the ethical position has to be, I'm not going to be part of certain things. And when that happens, I'm going to work with my colleagues to change how we do it, or at some point leave, right? Or take some action to rectify it. I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think you've again hit on like asking yourself those questions, right? When do I act? How do I act? It goes back to your theme of asking the questions.
Yeah, I have a one sentence comment. So patience should not be confused with silence. If I'm patient and I am working, I'm trying, I'm talking to people, even if you do not see any kind of visible change on the surface, that is not the same as being silent, and definitely not being complacent that who cares, it's not my job to fix it.
Okay, I want to just offer one last reflection and then we'll open it up to questions. Because Ruth, I wanted to come back to something that you said about we might not all agree, right? And in organizations, you're going to have multiple, first of all, you're going to have multiple ethical viewpoints, right? And they're going to be tied in a business to some implications for careers, for profits, and so on. And to me, a takeaway from this discussion is sort of the core competence for leaders and organizations of being able to host those conversations and surface those differences and convene around them, right? Rather than trying to erase them, because there won't be one viewpoint or one right. There will be many. Okay, over to all of you in the room and also those of you joining online. Questions, comments, reactions. Let's start back there. And Jessica's going to come around with the mic, so please wait till she gets to you.
I'm Maya, and I wanted to say thank you so much for the lecture. It was really valuable for me as I want to be a business owner in the future. And I have actually 3 questions. So we live in like capitalist system that prioritizes profits maximization, right? Like, do you think a truly ethical enterprise is possible? Okay, another question. So another question is about kind of future, because now we are implementing AI. Is it possible to implement like AI like ethically? Because it might lead to, for example, like worker displacement. Okay, next question. So do you think that ethics can be like context dependent, or like ethics is more like there should be some measure of it, and is it like possible to create a measure of like how ethical is the company? Thank you.
Okay, that was a lot. I'll let you pick which ones you want to tackle.
I'll take the first one. I'm happy to speak to all of those, but I'll just start with the first. What I find intriguing about this idea of, we're in a capitalist environment, we therefore say, therefore, we have to be unethical to survive. And I think that's not the case. I find it very interesting speaking to entrepreneurs, and you deal with a lot of entrepreneurs here, right? Ask an entrepreneur what gets them excited, or even someone starting a new business, right? They don't say I'm gonna make $1 billion, right? There's always talking about a customer need they're trying to address, a product or service they're trying to develop. They really are trying to make society better. That's what drives them. And this is, I guess, a challenge to Ruth's comment about does business always have to make society better? I think everything business does advances society, right? If I'm just selling food or I'm offering life insurance, I'm making society better. We've created this thing called financial measures different from social value. It's all social value, right? So I think businesses don't have to be at odds with ethics. I think it's a choice we make. My challenge often to businesses where they say, but if I must act ethically, my costs are going to go up. And I'd say, my friend, your cost goes up all the time for a whole bunch of reasons, right? If you're in the US, your tariffs are going applied to your business. What are you going to do? Close down your business? No, you innovate around it. So if you must source your products from an environment that doesn't harm people and raise your costs, well, do what you do all the other times when your costs go up, is innovate around it. And so it's a strange, so I don't see the dichotomy necessarily. I appreciate the tension between profit maximization being ethical. I don't think it's a necessary tension.
We like to talk about it as a productive tension, right? That the innovation can come from it,
Absolutely.
right? Do either of you want to tackle the AI question?
I actually agree with you, Ethel. You just put it much better than I did. Do you want to talk about AI or moral relativism?
All topics there.
Maya, I think I'll have an attempt at the moral relativism question. So I think you asked, can are business ethics context dependent? And this is a conversation, actually, again, we have a lot with the rising leaders, because we try and go back to some fundamental philosophical ideas. And I get really confused by your generation, if I'm allowed to put it that way, because I think on one hand, a lot of young people I meet feel very strongly that morality is context dependent, and that there are no universal values, and that, most universal values are very much imposed by Western thinking, Western philosophy, etc. But then on the other hand, for me personally, I think having recourse to some universal beliefs, especially in the world of business, is really, really important. So I want to be able to argue that human rights are, that's a bottom line that can't be crossed. whatever the context. So I actually firmly believe that there are some universal ethics that apply in all contexts, whatever the business.
That leaves AI for me. I'm not an AI expert. However, if you think of this as a great transition where things are changing very rapidly and rules and regulations are just playing catch up, right? I feel that from an ethics perspective, we cannot simply rely on rules and regulations. We have to think about, again, all the things that we have been talking about since the very beginning. We have to ask questions, and not just to leaders, not just people who are sitting at the top of the organizational hierarchy, people who are at the bottom, people who are out of the organization. So about job losses and various other consequences that we can clearly say it's going to happen, if you are driven by ethics, then there are ways to handle it. You know, even if there are job losses to come, there are ways to pay them fairly and make sure the transition is smooth. So some things are quite outside our control, and especially when it comes to technology and all the technical advancements we are seeing. But if you are operating with the right intention, and you have ways to make sure that you are protecting your people, you care about them, you have compassion, then I think we can handle that much better compared to, oh, there's AI, and so I'm firing 1,000 people tomorrow. Nothing could be done about it.
Goes back to where you started about how do you show up to the everyday in the everyday. Other questions? Sebastian. Oh, we gotta wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. Really insightful and inspiring. I was just wondering, do you think individualism and ethical enterprise can coexist?
You're supposed to be doing the cold calling.
I'm just doing the cold calling. I think it's an important question. I think individualism is part of the tension, or part it's the existence of individualism and its prevalence that creates part of the problem we face with profit versus ethics, right? I take less when I challenge unethical corporate behavior. Often the first reaction I get is, "Oh, so you're socialist or you're communist," right? And I think that's lazy thinking. There isn't a drop-down menu of different systems. We must choose one or the other, right? So within capitalism, the problem isn't capitalism often, it's the corporate players within capitalism, right? So a lot of my work is focused on corporate behavior because corporations cause the problem. And again, to Ruth's point, I think you can have individual ethics and corporate ethics as an entity. But I think the individualism is what makes it all about me as self alone. Now, where does this come from? This actually it's grounded in our economics, right? That this belief, very, very misguided belief, that if I act selfishly in my own interest alone, I'm actually doing good for society. Let me say this again, in case you didn't take Economics 101, right? Built into classical economics is the belief that when I act in my own selfish interest, it's the best thing to do because I'm also creating common good, right? And maybe people can correct me on that. And so that's built into our psyche, right? This is what we teach you at the Side Business School, at every business school, right? Act in your own self-interest. Now expand that individualist thinking to being a leader, right? That's going to prevail in that leader's behavior, and then into corporate as well. And so again, when I mentioned earlier this idea of private sector, company, it's separate from all the rest. It enforces this individualist behavior. Now, what's the alternative? So the alternative is, let me behave in a way that I've got my own selfish objectives. And again, because I speak so passionately about ethics, don't assume I'm a nice person, right? So I'm not wanting to hug everyone and cuddle everyone. I'm trying to get to justice. And often justice requires you take very hard decisions, take very strong actions. So what is required then is for companies to continue with the profit motive, absolutely. But set some principles around what they're not willing to do. Ethics is fundamentally about constraint, right? Well, certainly deontological ethics, so duty ethics, principle ethics, it says, I therefore will not do that. So when I say I'm an honest person, I've got to say I'm an honest person under all circumstances. Well, maybe that's not true. Because if my wife might get into trouble if I'm honest, I might lie under that circumstance. right? So we would talk about our values and our ethics as individuals and as corporations. We're going to say, what are the constraints under which I'm willing to operate? Now, people might say, the smart people will challenge me and I won't have good answers to them. They can say, well, look, look at Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote in 1970, won the Nobel Prize for Economics. He advised presidents around the world. Surely, Ethel, he knows better than you. And he said the only responsibility corporations have is to maximize profit. But that's, again, misleading, because further down, Friedman says, but operating within the social norms and the laws of society, right? So even Friedman, the modern father of capitalism, says there are constraints. And so the debate shouldn't be whether there are constraints or not. The debate should be, what are the constraints? And yet I find very few business leaders talking about what constraints they're willing to accept, and constraints on their profit and constraints on their behavior.
So I'm just going to translate it to the language we use at the school center, because I think it's actually quite similar, which is, you've articulated without using the words a kind of a both and approach, right? Of, it's not that there can't be capitalism or there can't be individualism, but it needs boundaries, or we would call them guardrails, right, within which to operate. And so it's not, is individualism good or bad, but alongside what does it coexist to keep it within the bounds of good? We have time for a few more questions. Yes, right here. Oh, hold on.
It's an interesting point that Athol made. And, I was listening to the point that, ethics is a spectrum as compared to a black and white. The question is more centered around, have the proponents of ethics gone too far and made it too purist? That's why businesses have considered it just like they consider compliance. And I will share a couple of examples, right? Rather than treating it with the contextual and the lens of pragmatism. And I have a long industry experience, and that's why I'm, asking this. Climate change. There are a lot of developing countries that cannot afford the cost of complying with that. Are we damaging the environment? Yes. Is it ethical? No. But then they have to come up the curve before they can start thinking about those things, because to Ruth's point, human rights and providing the basic necessities is a lot more important than worrying about the damage that they are causing to the climate. Or subprime crisis, where the regulators went completely too far and said, everyone now needs to tighten the lending criteria. We need to do X, Y, and Z. What it did is putting more in the pockets of the people who could afford it, and the first home buyers are struggling. So that's where I generally, this is my personal belief, but again, a question to yourself. Is there a moment of self-reflection for the proponents of ethics that they have made it absolutely a sword that people should live by and die by, or they need to mix and match the pragmatism or lens of pragmatism to say, okay, let's treat it as a spectrum, because not everyone is same, and one shoe fit all approach does not work.
Well, just so we don't keep cold calling on Athol, I agree with you. Unsurprisingly, what I would like to rescue, though, is the notion of ethical leadership. I would just phrase it slightly differently. I think ethical leadership is not about moral purity, as you put it, but I think it is about moral reasoning. And I think we should all be able to access our moral reasoning and to practice how we make our arguments.
I mean, just to put another language on that, to me, I'm not saying the outcome matters, but it's about the process. Okay, we're going to take one last question, and then we can continue the discussion at the reception. In the back, with the blue shirt, or yeah, blue and white shirt. It's not blue, is it?
Thank you. Super quick question. I'm just wondering, I feel as though young entrepreneurs do have like ethics as a priority in terms of like the vision for their companies. What sort of pressures and temptations do you think exist that can shift that priority of a young entrepreneur after they've started a company?
Oh, I mean, it's a world where you are getting pressured by everyone, starting from your Instagram followers and other people. So I think it really takes a lot to know what you are willing to, sacrifice, even though you see everyone else is doing, something else. That's why when you are at the university, when you still have some time to reflect and think and process, I think it's really important to ask yourself, what do I really stand for? Am I clear about it? Or am I just going to do what everyone else is doing and, feel pressured? So I think it depends on your own reasoning, your own values, and the clarity that we know we should have, but probably we don't reflect enough to really think about it.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us here in person, also online. And I want to especially thank Anjali, Athol, and Ruth for a really generative conversation. We will be having a reception. So those of you who are here in the room, I hope you'll stay and join us for a reception and more conversation. And our next seminar is coming up at the beginning of May 2nd, Friday, May 2nd. We'll be talking about social entrepreneurship in conflict and post-conflict setting. Hope to see many of you there.